Hey sis, picture this. What if everything we've been told about the evolution of humanity, God, spirituality, and who created things such as medicine, astrology, mathematics, and the system of language was all a lie? Imagine if the founding fathers and geniuses that sparked all of this was a group of black women who ruled before they, Europeans, colonised their lands and stole their workings. There's evidence to suggest that this is actually what happened. What we know today as Abrahamic religions based off of the text we call the Bible is an edited version of the reality that came from women called the Sibyls. According to the book, The Sibyls, the First Prophetess of Mami Wata, an academic, Vivian Hunter Hindrew, MD, otherwise known as Mama Zugba, this book caught my attention on two separate occasions over the last year. On the second time, I decided to read it. My aim here, via the coming short essays, is to share a summary of each of the short chapters, but very powerful chapters, with the main learning points and historical facts that point to the possibility that what we know today to be the Bible and how the world has evolved was possibly plagiarized from black women. These are black women who ruled a long time before the Bible was first recorded, according to the author's research. The saying, black women are the mothers of creation, is actually true if this book and research is to be relied on. So the author and the book's central claim. In chapter 1, we learn, according to the author, that long before Europe's classical age or Christianity's rise, Africa was led spiritually and by the order of black women. These would be the Sibyls, who served as oracles, healers, and moral authorities. These Sibyls are presented to readers as the first prophecies of Mami Wata. This is a water-based deity associated with power, beauty, healing, and wealth. In other words, these Mami Wata deities is who God was before all the Abrahamic religions of today. The author goes on to argue that Sibyl's influence, reign, and teachings stretched from North to West Africa into the Mediterranean world and then globally. It was their workings and way of living that shaped Greece, Rome, and eventually the Catholic and Christian Church. What the author claims is that Europeans, let's just say white XY males, stole and rewrote much of the black Sibyl women's history and made it their own. They created their history, in quotation marks, or the world's history, in quotation marks, an early start, based on the actual factual history of these black women and sold it to the world as how it all began. So according to the book, How Humanity Started via the Black Matriarchs. In the introduction, the author, who I'll refer to as Mama, she introduces readers to the concept that long before God, as we know him today and have always known him via the patriarchy, who gave us this idea of him, there was the Mami Wata goddesses, and she dominated the world. In fact, for more than 6,000 years, Africa was under matriarchal rule. This is nothing new. I'd say most of us black women around the diaspora are aware of this. This is where the European got their story, in quotation marks, from about the evolution of humanity. So myth number 1, was Noah a black woman? In chapter 1, very early on, the concept of black women rulers as Sibyls, the author introduces them as the black matriarchs, the keepers of oracles, temple healers, and political counselors. Their prophecies are what we see in the Bible today and always have been what we see in the Bible. The characters of the Bible are based on these women, according to her. The author writes, and this is a direct quotation, "The Sibyls are descendants from the Neolithic clans of African warrior queens, healers, prophets, and priestesses who were on the first ship built by the goddess to establish the new world after the Great Flood. Patriarchal oral history only recalls there being men, namely Noah and his 3 racially different sons. However, this is a myth and political and not historical. These 3 sons were all African, and there were African women, high priestesses called Sibyls, who issued forth the instructions from the divine African mother, Mami, as God, in quotation marks, on how to build the Argos, she's put in quotation marks, which is meaning the ark that Noah was on. and the giving forth of the prophecy pertaining to the end of their world as they knew it in ancient Babylon. This is from page 19 of the book, The Sibyls, the Prophecies of Mami Wata. This is a very powerful way to open a chapter. Here we see an example of how history was rewritten to suit the patriarchy we have today. The author, of course, doesn't just assert this. Mama does provide readers with an extensive bibliography and footnotes of where the evidence and research was found to sustain her arguments. What's interesting is that much of what she claims predates the Bible, but is in alignment with what is actually in the Bible, which would suggest that if this theory about black and female rule is true, what we know as history, religion, and the Bible today must have been doctored in some way from another predated source. Myth number 2. Where did the Bible and its content come from? So according to Mama, her research and her contemporary writers and researchers, white European men came to power by way of seizing everything that the Sibyls had created to make it their own, and this would predate slavery. Being men, they had the physical strength to overpower women, something that black African men had not dreamed of doing up until this point. We all know the story that yes, slavery was in Africa before the Europeans came along, and we also know that black men were the ones that sold women and children into slavery. Yes, these are both true, and yes, they have been factually proven. However, one must ask and critically think about where they, meaning black men, got the inspiration from to do this to women and children. If before this, black female rule was fully accepted, they could have only have done this if they were given the inspiration to do so. This inspiration, this came by way of Europeans physically overpowering the black monarchs, burning their temples, plagiarizing their recordings and prophecies. They created the Bible, a new religion. Then they burnt a majority, thankfully only, not all the evidence that the Sibyls were even in existence. The author goes on to assert it was the Sibyls' style of prophecy and magic that would later go on to be imitated by militant faction from these groups, meaning men, who were envious of her global positioning, rebelled against these divine matriarchal orders, and seized their temples and overthrew their priestesshood as patriarchy began to dominate. So this is from page 14 of the book mentioned. She also goes on to write, to conceal their crimes, they destroyed and deflated her name and all of her temples. They murdered and accused her prophecies or prophets of hearsay and witchcraft, and disguised her sacred rites and divine legacy as their own. This trend of random destruction they continued so that the world would never again know or honour her as the divine African mother, and this is on page 15. It's at this point in the chapter that the author is stating her case and evidence for the existence of black matriarchs and there being a god, in quotation marks, that was woman and black and of African descent that was honoured globally. Myth number 3, the Catholic claim to the Vatican in Rome. So as part of their strategy and erasure of black women's history and rule, the author has uncovered that the seat of the Vatican in Italy was originally occupied by the black Sibyl women. The claim is made that this location in the world, many deem as sacred and holy due to its links to the Catholic religion, was never really theirs, the Catholics, to begin with. They just made it theirs. In the forward section of the book, the author points out the fact that Africans erected civilizations in what was now Italy, thousands of years before the Anglo-Romans arrived. What is now called the Vatican in Italy was originally the sacerdotal seat of the ancient black Sibyls, and this is on page 3 of the forward. What the author wants black women, and we could say the world, to know in chapter 1 from reading this. The main message in chapter 1 is very clear, especially for her black women readers. Firstly, matriarchal sacred order. Via her research and that of other academics, there's evidence to suggest that a long-standing period of African women's religious authority, reign, and way of life, this was the norm, not exceptional, not any kind of myth or even any kind of made up idea. It's factual according to her. The way of life and the rulership of the Sibyls, the author sets out to prove, is what set the current and historical standard, in quotation marks, for all theology and the patriarchal rule we see today and have always seen, meaning God as a white man, God as in his teachings in the Bible, and various other texts that are derived from the Bible. The starting point was exactly this: the Black African woman's rule and way of life that predates all of what we see in the Bible and all of what we know today. The author goes on to assert that in Minoa and Macedonia, which was later renamed Greece, it was under the theocratic governance of the Sibyls as queen mothers that African matriarchal culture reached its golden age of achievement in medicine, religion, astronomy, philosophy, law, architecture, music, art, and social sophistication. So this is page 27 of the book, meaning that in the ancient world, as we have learned about it in school or in history, that Greece and all its achievements for humanity were not achieved by white Europeans or even the Greeks. Instead, it was by these black women and later rewritten to appear as if it were by the Europeans. What black women should take from chapter 1, in my view, from reading this? I would say firstly, the first thing to note is that after reading it, it is clear that the author is calling for black women to not see themselves as a supporting character in life, but a main character in the whole of humanity's evolution and in their own evolution as individual women. Secondly, I'm taking from this that she's putting forward the argument that water is a very sacred thing in many religions and practices. And remember that this is because the Black Sibyl women were, or we could argue are, still the rulers of it. There is a reason that water is sacred, therefore water should be honoured or respected greatly as black women in whatever way that may resonate to you. So Mami Wata is her, quotation marks, God's name according to this author, and she is depicted as a sea goddess. Thirdly, to remember that patriarchy was never the natural world's order. It was a manufactured state for women based on men's jealousy, and it could be argued well that this was the case when we look at the subjugation of women throughout history, be it with religion, laws, policies or practices that exclude women and their autonomy or advancement. Patriarchy was designed to control women and ensure that she never had any power again, not even her own self-autonomy. The fourth thing that I took from this, and I think that black women can take from this book just from reading this opening chapter, is that in today's context, the submission in quotation marks and traditional woman in quotation marks that the Blk Manosphere require from black women in particular should be disregarded, especially when they are asking you for a 50-50 relationship or to pay half or a majority of the bills in the same breath because they don't have a traditional man's money. It should also be disregarded because if we know that, if this author's research is to be relied on, this was not the way of the world, women's forced submission to men. This came along via things like Christianity and all the other man-made religions based on a white male god or any kind of male god. What predates this, all this creation that we've had about these male gods, is the fact that there was a possibility of a female and black god, and women were not in an oppressed position. This is just the tip of the iceberg with the opening chapter. There's a lot to cover and it is quite detailed, even though it's quite a concise book. For the sake of keeping the information bite-sized and not, overloading these little mini essays, as the weeks progress, I will be diving into the key messages throughout the book and for each chapter for black women. This is to help with understanding history, understanding where we've come from, and also helping women to understand how patriarchy actually came about, or the possibility of how it could have come about, to try and demonstrate that there is research and studies and books out there that point to the suggestion that women's subjugation underneath men, or women being this submissive woman, whether it be by laws, policies, religion, whatever the case might be, this could appear to be something that was not natural, and this was something that has been manufactured and forced among or upon, we could say, women at various points in history, also forced on various different races of women in very different ways, because I've always maintained the idea that Black women's oppression, while we can relate to some of the oppression that general women or white women go through or non-Black women go through, we as women do have a very specific set of oppressions that we feel very specifically from our own men. But putting all that aside and sticking to the point with this book and this chapter, these are the main points that I wanted to bring to you today. So thank you for listening if you are coming to the end of this. The actual link to the book, if you're listening to this on YouTube, I will put in the description box. If you are catching this on Substack, then it will be in the written version of the essay there for you. So much love until the next one. Thank you for listening. The Black Woman Essayist.